So, Robert, we would like to thank you very much for agreeing for an interview for the project that's called Oral History of Tibetan Studies. And we would like to ask you about your life.
Yes.
So, could we start with your family background and childhood? And first of all, where you come from, where were you born, and when were you born?
I was born in September 1947 in Cardiff, in South Wales. And yeah, kind of, my dad, at that time the streets were empty of cars. My dad had one of the first cars he was, so there was always, you could play in the gutter, play marbles in the gutter, and it was very safe to go out. There was virtually, it was quite a long street, but there was virtually just one or two cars there. Now it's all changed, of course. So we lived in the house that was a 3-story house, belonged to my father's mother, my grandmother. And the house was haunted. There was a ghost up in the top, which was in the area where my sister slept, my elder sister. So there were kind of a little bit of paranormal things were happening from the beginning.
Like what?
Like my sister would say that, you know, she'd be in bed at night and this man would get into bed next to her, sometimes, not always, not every night. And then my mum thought she was just, you know, kind of fantasizing, until one day my mother happened to see a man with a trilby hat walk through the wall. So there was this kind of background. And we had a dog called Bimbo, and I remember the dog wouldn't go up to the top of the house. If you did, its hairs would stand up, and you tried to pull it up and its hairs would stand up, and it'd be really kind of aware that something was there.
And did your parents come from Wales?
Yes, yeah, my mother's family was from Merthyr Tydfil, which is up in the valleys. And my father's family came from Devon, and they were seafarers, basically. They were families that owned boats, so the name Beer is a name common in Devon and Cornwall. And there's actually a town called Beer in Devon, which is Devon or Cornwall, just on the border. So although it's a horrible name to grow up with, going through school, you know, all of the jokes you get, and you happen to be almost at the top of the register, Alan, Baker, Beer, I was always like third on the register. It's just, you know, people think it's a joke, really. But, so that was hard to live with, still is, really, yeah.
And what was the profession of your parents in Canada?
My mum didn't really work, she was a kind of housewife. And my father worked, first of all, on the railways, repairing railway wagons. And this was in Cardiff Dock. And yeah, why not say it, you know. My dad got to know the people on the boats and would get watches from Holland, and cigarettes would come through from America. So, and then he moved on to working in a tyre depot, and of course a lot of the customers came in and he would sell them these contraband cigarettes and watches. So my father was kind of a very nice, likeable lad, really. And so there were always things coming in the house, you know, things coming in that he would buy and sell like that.
You had quite an awareness of different cultures at the time.
Not really, no, it was just growing up in Cardiff. But a big event that happened, the most important event was, I have an older sister called Wendy who lives in Caerphilly, which is just outside Cardiff. And my mother had a third child called Lynn, who was born with hydrocephalus, water on the brain. So initially she had a sac on the back of her neck, and the sac grew full of water. And they took her to London to perform some rudimentary surgery, which was putting a tube in to kind of cut this thing off the back of the neck, this thing of cerebrospinal fluid, and to put a shunt in, which was a tube. So this was preliminary work. Now it's quite common. This was hydrocephalus she had. And so she basically, the operation didn't work, so there was nothing one could do. And then the head grew bigger and bigger. And the face was basically underneath the head, so her head was actually almost like elongated out here, and with the face underneath and a very small body. And all he could do was turn her over. And she became the kind of centre of the whole focus of the family. She lived to be 3, but during those 3 years nobody ever came into the house. We didn't have visitors unless they were family. And if people did come in, my mother would put a clothes horse around her cot so nobody could see, that she was there, basically. So it was a kind of very odd change of life, really, to grow up with this situation. And she lived to the age of 3 and died when I was 14, and that was the beginning of a change in my life, really. Because, shall I carry on? Because on the day that she died, I knew she was dying. I was in the next room, but because I was quite young, I was 14 years old, I think, yeah. The doctor came and I wasn't allowed to go in the room, and and then I knew that she died just because of the whole atmosphere of the place. And in the next morning, I wasn't allowed to see a body, but an undertaker came and they brought a little coffin and put it in the front room of the house, this very small coffin. It was a very, very sad experience. But the day after she died, I was asleep, and then suddenly I was in a very lucid dream. My awareness became extremely lucid, and I was flying through this beautiful blue heavenly realm with this wonderful female figure beside me, who I knew was my sister, not as a 3-year-old deformed child, but as a kind of almost like what people would think of in Tibetan realms as a dakini. She was actually very beautiful. And it was almost like there was telepathic communication. She was showing me who she was. And this kind of flight through this very, very pure blue heavenly realm seemed to go on and on. It was like being transmitted to me that the presence of my sister was not this particular physical form in this life, but was an immortal spirit. It took me a long time to realize what that meant. I never told anybody about the experience. But what happened at the end of the dream, or the lucid dream, was that we passed near a church, and the bells were ringing in the church, and I woke up to the sound of the doorbell ringing, and it was my mother and father coming back from church. And that was a very, very clear and profound experience that stays with me as clear as it is now. So that was the thing that set me onto what eventually became a spiritual path at the age of 14.
So how has it changed your perception?
Well, kind of, because it was such a sad story and she was so pure and nobody really knew about her, she was kind of just kept there, and it was like something that nobody ever spoke about apart from us. What was quite amazing was that even though she had no mental development, she would never be able to speak, she would relate very strongly to music or to various ways that you spoke to her. You could really, very easy to make her laugh, and it was very easy to make her cry. You could put on a certain record and it would make her cry, and you had certain records that would really make her laugh. So there was this kind of very strong awareness of the polarity of pleasure and pain in her, I think. So it was kind of a very profound teaching. It was almost like she was my real teacher from that time on. And after she died, then yeah, then the question, you know, what is life and what is death and what is God and what is religion? And I was questioning these things. So I became very much questioning and would ask people, you know, looking for guidance, really. And then one day, I guess when I was maybe a year or two older, maybe about 16, I was going to a kind of Saturday morning dance thing with friends. There was a kind of dance club where you could go, boys and girls would go, and kind of that was the beginning of that time. And I happened to see this tramp standing just on the road with a big coil of rope around him, classed as a tramp because he was just standing very, very still. And I kept bumping into this person who would always be standing somewhere very, very still. And eventually I got up the courage to go and speak to him. And he was from somewhere in Eastern Europe. And he was almost like a siddha, I guess. And he said something to me, which I can't really explain in words, but it kind of, something clicked. I asked him what the secret of life was, and he bent down and whispered in my ear, B-E, which is B, basically. And maybe it was enigmatic, but that kind of, meeting that character began that kind of thing of being attracted to the road and being able to hitchhike around the country. And my mother and father separated, fell apart, the whole thing fell apart. My father hadn't found another woman, and my mother eventually found another man, and I no longer had a home, so about the age of 16 I was homeless. So for the next few years I travelled on the road a lot, hitchhiking.
Do you go?
Mainly in going up to London or down to Cornwall and St Ives. And then I met some of the beatnik generation. People who were living on the road before the kind of real counterculture came. This was probably in 65, 66. Would I be 64, 65, 66, like that. Hitchhiked around Britain a lot. Went up to Scotland with a friend. Down to Cornwall many times, up to London, go to Glasgow to look at art. Was very into art. And it was around this time then I met John Miles, who became my artistic mentor. He took me in as kind of a part of the family.
How did you meet him? How did it happen?
It happened because a friend in school, who paradoxically I'm going to actually meet tomorrow in Hove in Brighton, his mother had some Pekingese dogs, and Miles's parents, his mother had been a Carmelite nun, and his father was a communist artist, and he worked on newspapers and did a lot of drawings for, like the Cardiff Museum. There are a lot of his paintings in there of Welsh mines and things of that nature. So John was the product of a very rational socialist, communist father and a mother who was learning violin as a child and got a job. This was in St Agnes in Cornwall, got a job playing violin in the local cinema, which was a silent movie. And so the story goes, one day missed the last bus, the last tram home, and was walking, and she knew her parents would be very angry with her, so she passed the Carmelite nunnery and went inside, and evidently didn't leave there for 16 years. And Carmelite nuns are very, very strict, until she got ill and was taken to hospital. And then she would have been probably around 30, and for the first time she met men, and she fell in love with the doctor who was treating her, and then started to fall in love with every man she met. And she happened to meet John's father in a newspaper shop one day, and so John was the product of these two beings. And he was really, really radically eccentric. He was really very powerful character. A very, very brilliant artist. He was only a couple of years older than me, but it felt like he was almost like he was a substitute for a teacher who'd studied art more than anybody I knew, and he really knew art inside out.
How did you meet him?
Because I got taken to his house by this friend whose mother had Pekingese, and John's father had Pekingese, I believe. Or John's father's second wife had Pekingese dogs, and that's it. So they happened to know each other. So John said I must meet, my friend Fran, who I'll meet tomorrow, said I must meet John, and he took me there. And when I arrived, his wife, Carol, opened the door and was very shocked to see this figure outside, and then she called John, and then John came out, and they were both very shocked because John's friend had just committed suicide a week before, and I looked exactly like this person. So I became almost like, he was his closest friend, so I became his surrogate, I guess. And John was, until he died in 1997, was a very strong influence in my life, yeah, and me in his life, really.
Who did he study with, or how did he learn?
I don't even know how all of this happened. He just knew so much about art. He introduced me to, you know, the books I read at that time were The Horse's Mouth, which is by Joyce Carey, a book on a character called Gully Jimson. Gully Jimson was based on somebody who I knew about later in life, who was also a wild character, called Wilde, John Wilde or James Wilde, who ended up living in a Sherborne house, which is a Sufi community, and was really an alcoholic. It was based on his life story. But John really was almost like brought up in this background of his father as a communist artist and his mother as a spiritual nymphomaniac, basically. The combination of these two, and he was a very, very big character, but he knew so much about the lives of the artists. I don't know where that knowledge came. It was almost like, and he was really bent on becoming the greatest colorist the world ever knew. So his perception of color was phenomenal, and he was a very powerful human being, really powerful.
How would you characterize him? By a story, or by description?
I would characterize him as being fearless, being far larger than life. When he went to a football match, he would shout louder than anybody, you know, and he'd always have the funniest comments. And even when he was dying, I remember him telling me that he'd been with some people in the cafe, and they came out and there was this gang outside and they were just swearing, and John said, you know, he said, you should work in a fucking reference library to this guy. And there was a moment of kind of tension, and John thought, I can't fight like that anymore, you know. But he had a very long pipe. This is going to go on for hours, this conversation. He had a very long pipe, and one day, I'll tell you a story, he was walking his girlfriend home in Newport across the railway bridge late at night, and there was a motorcycle gang, about 7 guys on their motorbikes on the bridge, and they started to make trouble, and they started to mess around with the girl he was with. And John said, no, boys, we just want to peacefully go. And then the gang leader got his pipe and broke it in half. Half hour later, the police came, and John was in the process of trying to throw the motorbikes over the railway bridge. And these people had broken jaws and broken arms. He was very, very violent when he was aroused. But that kind of raw passion in that particular person, and to channel it into the art that he produced, I've never ever, you know, you have all of these things about artists nowadays, none of them will ever approach the intensity of what was in this being artistically. It was phenomenal.
So how did you
Well, I couldn't go to art college because I was colourblind. And John was very upset about this, so that was why he took it on to basically mentor me. So I just lived with him, and, you know, we'd go out to the market and he'd be infatuated, the Cardiff market, with the colours of the fruit and vegetable market, you know, the market. He'd paint there a lot, but just because of the intensity of the people moving and the coloured fruit. So a lot of his early work was I would say, a colourist, impressionist. He was very profoundly influenced by Van Gogh, as I was essentially, as a not so much as just an artist, but as a Van Gogh's personality. I think was phenomenally generous and bodhisattva-like being. Yeah, so that was a very strong influence, I guess. And then John's work, some of it is in the hall. You can see a couple of his prints, and you know, he ended up painting these mandalas, which would take literally several years each to paint. But they were just mandalas of life itself, not geometric structures like Eastern mandalas.
Was he interested in Asian art?
He was interested in everything, yeah, everything under the sun, yeah. And brilliant, really brilliant. Brain of Britain, really. Fantastic memory, fantastic knowledge, fantastic ability in sport. Anything he did was really radical. And of course he had lots of women lovers. And he always said I was the only woman he could ever live with. So I saw him get, you know, at times he'd get really aggressive with people, but he was never ever like that with me. I was always kind of his, almost like I was his feminine side.
It was in Cardiff?
In Cardiff, and later in Devon. He moved to Torquay in Devon. And yeah. And his family, yeah, and my family in a sense. And even though I don't see them, I feel bad about it because John's now dead. But the presence of, and my connection to all of that time is still very, with much gratitude and love, yeah.
And, what other influences did you have at the time, and from Western art?
I was very influenced by Salvador Dali, and while I was living with John, whenever I would stay there in the house he was in, I would copy Salvador Dali paintings. So that was, and also drawing. I was quite good in school at drawing. And I love drawing. My dad taught me how to draw a bit when I was very young.
Yeah, I was wondering, as a child, what kind of interests you had in general, and then what brought you to art? Because I think you were quite drawing as a child.
Yes, yeah, my father would draw airplanes and boats. He was good at that, and then so I learned to draw planes and boats. And yes, in school I guess was pretty good at that. I remember breaking my right arm, and probably when I was 16, and I couldn't sit the exams, but I did the art exam, and I drew a dentist chair with my left hand, and came top of the class. And the headmaster was really angry that I'd managed to sit this one exam and clearly showed that I could use my hand but not able to write.
Why did you find it interesting?
What?
Drawing at the time, or art? What drew you to it?
Because I had a book called Tanks and How to Draw Them, which was based on Second World War tanks. It was a book of sketches of Second World War tanks. And I was really fascinated by the structure, mechanical structure. I also used to make model aeroplanes and model boats out of balsa wood. And I had some older friends who were much more skilled at making models than with me. And then later on I went to make astronomical telescopes, grind in the lenses, like that, yeah. I didn't make that one, commercial one. So I've always worked with the hands, and I became fascinated with, while I was in school, with cosmology, I guess, and aspects of science like that, especially the astronomy and cosmology. So tanks and how to draw them, with all of their complexity, their caterpillar tracks, there's a spade here, you know, here there's some kind of mechanism for doing something, and there's lights here, and it's not so much of a leap from drawing tanks to drawing Russell deities, really, because they have similar kind of quality of all of this armaments everywhere.
So it must have been legacy of the World War.
World War II, yes, yeah.
And it was a children's book.
No, it was for adults. It was how to draw tanks, yeah. Every kind of conceivable tank, and I tried to copy them all, and yeah, so.
So after you met John Miles, you stayed with him for some time, and then you decided to go to India.
No, then I made a trip I had a friend who was going to go hitchhiking through France, and he'd left England, and I left about a week later, and I knew he was going to stay at youth hostels, and I went to some of the youth hostels he was in, and then they had a date because you'd signed the book when you stayed there, and it reached a point where I was 3 days behind him, then I was 5 days behind him, then I lost him completely. So I thought, well, what shall I do? So I carried on hitchhiking and went right across to Istanbul. And there, kind of 1965 or 66, Istanbul. That's the first people go into India. And so I came into contact with people smoking dope. Maybe before that, I think before that also I'd been loosely involved in that. And then LSD was just starting to come along, and I remember meeting an American from California, kind of Tim Leary's kind of generation, and I spent a lot of time in the Blue Mosque in Istanbul, and became fascinated by the iconography, but by this time I think I was already much into religious symbolism. So in the time of the psychedelic days, I would often go to a church on some psychedelic, use the LSD, and the church would speak to me, and so I became very involved in Gnostic Christianity, the immanent Christ rather than the Christ as portrayed in Christian religion, especially in the West. So I began looking into the New Testament, which is still an amazing resource for me, and realized that you can perceive these things in a very different way than the church has taken them now. And then, of course, there was Carl Jung, was also a strong influence, and Carl Jung was, I'm trying to remember the name, it was basically on Aeon, A-I-O-N, which is his work on the phenomenon of Christ. So at this time I started making paintings based on Arthurian legends and Christian, almost like in a interior Christian Gnostic imagery, rather than an exterior, kind of trying to make contact with the divine within oneself, rather than the divine as being outside.
That was in England when you returned from Asia?
It was before, and no, Asia. Well, I wouldn't actually call Turkey Asia. It's on the cusp of Asia. But that was a few years later when I actually went to India.
So you went to Istanbul, then you returned to England?
Then I returned to England. I got into trouble. I had 3 years probation for possession of dope. So I couldn't really leave the country. So from 67 till 1970, I was in England, Wales, or mainly in Wales and in London. And then, of course, all of the 60s, late 60s were happening, so I was very involved in that. Started learning to play sitar.
England?
Yes.
With whom?
There was a centre called, I think it was called a centre in London. Yeah, just when the Swamis started coming here, and I met these Swamis, Satchitananda. I remember meeting various teachers like that, and became involved with people just who were students of Ramakrishna. So there was a very strong Hindu connection in my life also, and I guess there was a part of me also that had this fantasy of going to Tibet to become a monk, which of course was a fantasy back at that time because I really didn't know the political situation in the world.
What did you imagine it to be like? Why did you want to be
I guess I'd read some books by Lobsang Rampa. Yeah, Lobsang Rampa was very popular in those days. So it took a while to his book started getting more and more wacky, basically, when he started talking about cats and things like this. But at the beginning, I think Doctor from Lhasa and The Third Eye, I think, were quite revolutionary at that time. And then I came on Trungpa's work, as early Born in Tibet. I read those things and just gravitated to Hinduism and Buddhism.
Did you meet any Indian or Tibetan spiritual teachers in UK?
No, I didn't at that time, not at all, as far as I remember, no. But various Indian Swamis who came over, yeah. I wouldn't say many, but a few.
And what did you find so interesting about music?
Well, I also played guitar before and would sing in folk clubs and things like that. It was just a lot of stuff, really, because I was homeless and it's very hard to explain how that was. You see all these people homeless on the streets now, but it wasn't like that for me. There was nobody else around like that. And if there were, they were called beatniks, and there were very few of them, and they would hitchhike to different places. And I would do that, and every day the police would pick me up, take me to the outskirts of town, search me, and then it was like that. It wasn't just hanging out trying to collect money. One was on a journey, really. And often you would get picked up by people who were very interested in cars, and like sometimes an ex-vicar would take you to his houses, and he had caravans where lots of other people were staying for free, for example. So there was a lot of... in the 60s was an incredible time, of course.
Yeah, it was a spiritual journey.
It was becoming more and more spiritual, essentially, yes, yeah.
You were probably influenced by the psychedelic experience you had.
Yeah, I was...
Many other people.
I certainly was, yeah. And to me the psychedelic experience was a very interior experience. Evans Wentz, Yoga and Secret Doctrines. I was fascinated by the life of Milarepa. And I guess on LSD I was practicing what essentially was POA. And eventually had a very traumatic experience in 1969, which was the very last time I took LSD. I took a very small amount, quarter of a tablet of orange sunshine. There was still some left. And and I had a very profound experience where I died, physically died. I went unconscious. I felt something rising up inside going up my body and getting lots of sweat pouring down very, very quickly. And then I felt it going up very strongly into my skull. And I knew I was going to die. I stood up and I said, I'm gone. And my head exploded. And I just remember this kind of huge kind of vision of these like blue veins going out. It was almost like my head became this huge concrete block and fell very slowly to the floor. And I was completely unconscious, and they took me outside. I came round about half an hour later, and I knew the world would never be the same again. So I was in psychosis then for 7 years, and that's when I went to India.
So how has the world changed this time?
I guess, how's the world changed from that?
For you, if you say the world was never the same again.
Well, it took me about 9 months before I could leave Britain. I thought I'm going to be put in a mental hospital. Every day I would have these terrible experiences of like you were on LSD and you couldn't control it. It was awful sensations, like knitting needles in the ears and this taste of gunpowder almost in the mouth, and the eyes just almost like electricity just roaring through the body. And the worst part of it was anything I touched would become part of my body. And it was very hard if you went to the dentist and the dentist was working on your mouth, and your face, you'd feel your face was nothing was solid anymore. It was like everything I touched became part of me. So it was very difficult to exist in that state. So that would come on pretty much every day for a period of time. I had no control over it. And when it happened, when I'd start to go into those states, I'd have to go out and walk on the streets, basically. And sometimes I'd find myself walking on the street. I wouldn't know where I was. Almost like there were demonic voices, and I felt like my legs were actually in the pavement. It was like you couldn't determine where the body ended, where the body began and where it ended. And it just didn't seem to stop. And I was in a lot of fear because I felt I don't want to die in this state. The worst thing I could imagine was to die with all of this going on, because I knew too much about the possibilities of afterlife, or I thought I knew too much about the possibilities. That if you die with this, you're doomed forever. You know, it's almost like the end of the world. So that's when I went to India, hitchhiked across to India.
And you didn't finish the school, your school?
My school? No, I finished, just did O levels and I left. I was basically, just didn't want to be in school anymore, really.
And it was in Cardiff,
yeah.
Public school?
Yeah, my parents had separated by then, and I didn't really have a home. So while I was in school, the person I'm going to see tomorrow, Fran, used to leave the conservatory of his house open. So when his mum went to bed, I'd climb in and sleep on the sofa. I knew she knew, but I had various school friends whose mothers would look after me. So even when I was in school, I basically was not really had a home as such.
So why did you decide to go to India?
Because India was the only refuge possible, really. I knew a lot about Indian culture, especially Hindu culture, and playing the sitar as well, which I didn't take to India with me. So with my girlfriend, we hitchhiked across to India. It took several months.
How do you remember the journey?
The journey was very memorable because on the journey, hitchhiking from Austria, from the border of Austria, were picked up by a trio, 3 trucks that were going to Tehran, with 3 drivers in the trucks. One of them was from, I can't think at the moment, my memory is not good. One of them was Haji. Haji was the one. The trucks were parked at the Austrian border, and I went up with my girlfriend and asked for a lift, and there were 2. One was from Georgia, one was from Azerbaijan, and Haji was from Tehran. There were 3 different truck drivers. They were in a convoy. I asked one of them, and he said, "Oh, you have to see the boss." The English wasn't very good, and this was Haji, and there was this big, huge character who looked at my palm. He wanted to look at my palm, so he looked at my palm, and as he looked at my palm, the sun came out. And I remember him looking, and I remember the sun, because it had been cloudy, the sun suddenly came out like a beam almost, very strange. And he said, "Your name is Rob Morrow." He said, "You come with me." And then we travelled, it seemed ages, this journey across. But he was called Haji because he'd made the pilgrimage, not just the pilgrimage to Mecca, but he'd really made the pilgrimage. And he was a larger-than-life figure again, like John Miles, my friend. And he was quite incredible. Everywhere we would stop, little villages, we'd stop somewhere and everybody would come. He was like the elder. They would come and he would settle disputes and he would just sort things out. And he taught me a lot in that journey about really being a true Muslim. And he was a real Sufi. And I travelled to Tehran with him, and I became very enamoured of him as a teacher. And when we got to Tehran, I didn't want to leave him. He was so fascinating. You know, he travelled through India. He could throw his voice, he could do ventriloquism, he could mimic Indian songs. He was really a larger-than-life character who'd really spent a lot of time. And I just, he wrote something down I had a little address book, which I thought was his address, but it was a prayer in characters that I couldn't understand. And then I spent some time in Tehran where I contracted cholera and was in the hospital there, also nearly dying from cholera, and was picked up by some Baha'i people, 2 students from the Baha'i faith, and lived with them while I recovered, and before in a Baha'i household in Tehran for about maybe 6 weeks. And the Baha'is were seriously persecuted by the Muslims. So I think those 2 students, they were very beautiful, very lovely young men, and very, very kind and generous, and looked after us very well. And I think they might have, God knows what happened in Iran after that. And from there, travelled. I've avoided Afghanistan because everyone was going there to smoke dope, and that was all over for me. Those days completely gone. I couldn't smoke dope anymore. So we travelled through the Great Salt Desert, hitchhiked through the Great Salt Desert of Iran to a place called Nalkundi, which is on the border of Afghanistan, Iran and Pakistan, where I happened to meet another Sufi person who had been exiled from Morocco when he was 12 years old. And even though I only stayed for maybe a week in this place, waiting, we couldn't really leave. We had to wait for a bus to come. In that time also I had a very profound influence from this person. So Sufism also became a very strong current in my life, and still is. A lot of I read a lot of Sufi stories still. I find fascination by the whole traditions of Hinduism, Buddhism and Sufism, Gnostic Christianity still. So on that level I find an open awareness amongst them all, essentially.
And how have these 2 Sufis you've met?
Well, there were more than that. There were others. Very profoundly, because they were so honest. They were really so honest and so, I would say, so humble as well. Honest humility and this humbleness of just being very pure in mind and heart, natural purity that you'd find in Tibetan, some Tibetan tukus, of course, like that.
They had a certain spiritual reflection of the world.
Yeah, Habim was the one I met in Nalkundi, and in that situation, I travelled with 2 people from Pakistan, 2 men from Pakistan, and my girlfriend. They were always after my girlfriend. They weren't very nice, and they were trying to make the trip, the Haji. They were trying to go to Mecca, and they didn't do it. They turned back and travelled with them. And when we arrived at this place, Nalkundi, it was really really hot. It was like 45 degrees. This is a long story. Is this okay? Yeah?
It's very interesting.
It was very, very hot, and it was so hot there was hardly anywhere to shelter. And there was, at the bottom of this tiny, tiny place, which was really desolate, as now is a place where the Taliban are. It was a very dangerous place. It was a well. It was the well for the water source, of course, and there was a dog trying to find shade in the well, and this figure came, like walking from nowhere, almost like a young kind of, he was a young Sufi basically, and he went to the well and pulled up some water and gave the dog water, and I thought, why didn't I do that? And then he was just an amazing character to meet, and he'd been exiled from Morocco. He'd been in that particular place for like 6 months, and he couldn't travel anywhere else because he had no papers or passport, essentially. And he was a real Sufi, and he'd been in India for a long time. So he told me a lot about India and where to go in India.
And you spoke English with all of them?
Yeah, yes.
So how did you arrive to India? Where did you go?
Arrived to India, yeah, it was monsoon time, beginning of monsoon. The rivers were in flood. Went to Varanasi, which was a completely incredible place to be for the first time. I stayed there for a while, and then the river was really in flood, and of course Varanasi is, at that, I don't know what it's like now, it was very crowded then, and I ended up living there for probably 3 years eventually. But from there we moved on to Kathmandu, and that was my first encounter with Newar and Tibetan culture, essentially, really.
Where did you live in Kathmandu?
Even though I knew about that, Swayambhu. I always lived in Swayambhu when I was... No, just below, at the bottom. The house, the first house I was in, is still there, still exists. Yeah. So I was there in Swayambhu, and it happened to be the time of Buddha's birthday. Would it have been? No, it must have been another festival. It was a festival where they bring all of the tonkas out.
Yeah, in August.
In August, that would have been it then, yeah. Okay. And then there was one particular painting of Foram Chendraji that was quite phenomenal, which other people have seen from maybe that same year, because I sometimes find it on the internet. A Foram Chendraji that was almost the kind of the style that I was painting deities in at that time. I was starting to paint deities.
So you started painting deities in India?
No, before I went. I was painting...
In England?
Yeah.
Hindu and Buddhist deities?
Yes, figures that were kind of Hindu and Buddhist mixture, one would say, yeah.
And how did you get to them?
Well, we spent a lot of time in meditation, and a lot of time in meditation on LSD with people who were not going out to rock music raves or anything like that, but just sitting very, very still and having a very deep inward experience with various people who were very close to me. And that they were all on a strong spiritual path. A lot of them, a couple of them went off to join the Radhakrishna movement in India, and as far as I know, are still there, essentially. One became the treasurer of the Krishna consciousness movement in India. So those are the people I was involved with. They kind of went on to do different things, spiritual things essentially, mainly Hindu rather than Buddhist, I guess.
So you arrived to India,
Yeah.
and Paul already as a painter of Hindu and Buddhist deities.
Interesting. I would say at that time, because of my mental state, I was 21 years old, I guess. 23, and then 21 when I had this acid experience, 22 actually, or 21 or 22. And that lasted for 7 years, which was basically all of the time I was in India. And it was almost like it was a demolition of the ego. I couldn't really function very easily.
The art was helping you?
Yeah, the art became a vehicle of a transformation, and also music. Yeah, I could absorb myself for hours and hours just kneeling down, painting or practicing music.
So what did you study first in Varanasi and later in Kathmandu?
I didn't really study anything in Varanasi at that time. Went on to Kathmandu and then began making paintings, working, because I was painting before I went in England. And I remember making paintings and then coming across Newar art and architecture for the first time, and really Tibetan art. So seeking things out and familiarizing myself with the landscape, you know, going out on bicycles, cycling around the Kathmandu Valley. 1970 was fantastic. No pollution.
Yeah,
Boda.
how do you remember the place at the time? What were your impressions?
Well, there weren't any modern houses really. All the houses had very low doors, and you had lights, you know, lamps inside. There was electric wasn't really available that much. Very few cars. The only cars were on New Road, which were usually Volkswagens that Westerners had travelled over and were trying to sell. Very few motorcycles, just bicycles and people walking around carrying baskets and, you know, the usual coolie kind of culture. So yes, Swayambhu was my first point of call there, really. And then for the winter, I went down to Goa, where I started making the painting of the life of Milarepa, an oil painting that was very big on canvas.
Yep. Why did you feel close to Milarepa?
Because Milarepa, the life story was so... his life story is so amazing. He was profound. He was like my hero, the archetype. So he had to go through all of these trials in order to begin, really, at the beginning again. Yeah. So it was the life of Milarepa was, of course, the Evans Wentz was the first version at that time, apart from Born in Tibet by Trungpa and a few other basic books mainly on Theravada Buddhism. I don't think there was that much available, really. Generally available.
How long did it take you to complete the painting?
Well, the problem was I was in Goa and we were living by a road in front. There was a road, and of course trucks would go by. It was oil paint. So dust would come and it would settle on the oil paint. And so I kept repainting it again and again and again. And eventually that painting I gave to a friend of mine in India who was a sitar player several years later, who liked it, who died in India while I was, just after I left actually. But while I was in Goa making this painting, I'd also always have sadhus gravitate towards me. To me, I was always open to sadhus. And I remember one sadhu coming one day and looking at this, and he said, "Oh, there's a place called Dharamsala." He said, "It has a school of 1,000 Buddhas. You must go there." He said. So, leaving Goa in the spring, I hitchhiked up to Dharamsala, and then arrived in Dharamsala with virtually no money, no clothes, no nothing, a few paintbrushes, and lived in Dharmkot, which is at the top. Met Mr. Hallett, who was an Englishman who had a house at the top of Dharmkot, his family had mills in Kashmir. And he was an artist. He had a beautiful English garden. He never went down the hill. He had a car parked somewhere in a garage in Lower Dharamsala. and he probably hadn't been down the hill for several years at the time. He had his servant Muzaffar used to bring him supplies up and dress up in the kind of coat and ties to feed him, to serve him dinner in the night. It was a very strange relationship. But I moved into Dharmkot, and then gradually Westerners were just starting to become interested in Tibetan Buddhism then, and one of the people who came was Garado Abud. He's now Sokni Rinpoche's main translator. Garado Abud was there. Charles Janud, who was a Thongka painter, who was studying Thongka painting with Jampa. Georges Dressier. These all went on to become teachers in their own right, really. So they were just, the library was just on the verge of opening at that time, the Tibetan library. And so it was just at the beginning of all of those things. Dharamsala MacLeod Ganj was a very little sleepy place at that particular point. And
how do you remember the Tibetan community there at the time?
Being very impoverished, very, very beautiful and humble. But we were living at the top, so we'd come down maybe twice a week to get supplies and go back up. And then eventually moved down to what was then Naraji's cottage, which then became Tushita Center, I think, Tushita Center. And now Murray and Tina Feldman. Tina Feldman later became she lives in Devon now, is a very famous Vipassana teacher. Murray and Tina. So those people were just starting to come, Westerners who would spend many years usually involved in Tibetan studies or Theravadan studies. Some, because Theravadan Buddhism was also making inroads at that time with Goenka teaching Vipassana meditation. So I moved to Dharamsala, and then eventually found out that Jampala was living in Lower Dharamsala. So moved into the compound there, which was then, it was called the Old Tibetan Transit School, but I tried to find it recently on the internet, but there doesn't seem to be any records of it. It was in Lower Dharamsala, but originally Jampala was the main Thongka painter there.
Jampala was the painter of His Holiness?
That's, yes,
He escaped with him into the exile?
That I would imagine he probably did. I'm not really sure if he came at the same time. That I don't know, actually. It never occurred to me to ask that.
So how did you meet him? How did you become to study with him?
Well, Charles was studying with them. Charles Janud, who was Swiss. Charles felt so much more mature than myself. And he'd already been studying with Jampala. And so because Jampa was so busy, I had commissions all of the time. I basically, Charles had drawings already of sketches from Jampa, so I started copying those sketches. So I'd take them in, and then he'd, do the corrections. And at the time he had some one young Tibetan boy, who would just continually draw the face of the Buddha on a chalkboard, and then next, carry on, and then draw the body of the Buddha, and then the head of Guru Rinpoche, and the head of Manjushri, and like this, building up slowly. And Jampa said he'd teach me, and my girlfriend, because she was also painting Thongka. She was very good, actually, Frances. If we taught his children English, but we spent a lot of time with the kids, but we didn't really teach them English. We just played around a lot, so we had fun with the kids. Pooh and Pema, these two children at that time, and Pooh is now a famous quite a well-known Thongka painter, I believe. Inherited the tradition from his father.
Where does he live?
I presume he's in Dharamsala still. I really don't know. I haven't really been back. I went to Dharamsala in the late 90s, and it just changed so much, and I have a breathing problem, so it's very difficult to walk anywhere because there's hills wherever you go, so I haven't been back since, really.
So, how was it studying with Jampala? So you were copying the copies of his work?
Yeah, I was
from that?
making copies of his work and also painting deities. So I began to paint deities for Westerners who were starting to come to go to the library, and they would want an image of Vajrasattva. You know, they'd been given the practice of Vajrasattva, so I'd make little paintings of them from Vajrasattva and, you know, ask them to give me what they could. And some people, I remember one person gave me a sketchbook, having spent a week making this painting for them. Another person gave me a square of brocade. Westerners are very mean, basically. So while I was also in Kathmandu later, I also made lots of paintings for Westerners, small paintings for the Yidam practice or the deity practice, really. Yeah. So most of those have disappeared and into the void.
So with Jampala, you mainly learned by copying what he was doing?
Yeah, I mean, copying what he was doing by going in and sitting with him and watching him work, and more than anything, by just literally being on the other side of that wall, I knew he was working. And Francis and I would draw all day, or paint all day, and then we'd go out late at night, and the only other light on in the whole area was his and ours. So it was that kind of osmosis, because it's such a time-consuming practice, essentially, that it really is, I would say, more of a meditational practice in Tonga painting than taking on a particular deity practice. For me personally, I think more was accomplished by sitting at the drawing board for 15 hours a day for basically 30 years, which is what I did when I came back from the West to the West. Learning to have the ability to just be with yourself, essentially, for long periods of time.
How do you remember Jampala as a person?
He was wonderful. He was really the epitome of open-heartedness, humility, deeply talented, of course, deeply knowledgeable, but at the same time very, very humble and very giving, very considerate and kind. And he taught many people.
Tibetans and Westerners?
Tibetans and Westerners, yeah. He had young Westerners who went on to be, young Tibetans who went on, but the Westerners, of course, wouldn't want to have a chalkboard and draw the face of Buddha again and again and again. They'd want to copy some image of the deity. So there are quite a few. I don't know how many people studied with him. After me, there was a lady called Marian Archer, who lives in London. She'd be interested to interview. She's very sweet. And then Kenji Babasaki spent a long time. He's Japanese, of course. He became, I would say, Jampa's main student, really, and went on to create really wonderful works. So he spends, I think, half of his time in Dharamsala still, maybe he used to be, and most of his time in Japan, in Tokyo, as a Tonka painter.
So, how long were you studying with Jampa?
I would say for 10 months or so, and then left there, and then went to Manali. I basically left Dharamsala because so many other Westerners were arriving and the library was happening. And everyone was so serious about practice and learning Tibetan and meditation. And I just wasn't like that. I was just interested in the in the art, and it almost felt that that was a spiritual practice to me. And my later teacher did confirm that, basically. That's another story. But
Yes, yes. Yeah, it's very fascinating.
okay, so from there, went to Manali, and then met Apa Rinpoche, who was basically a Drupa Kagyu teacher, a teacher of Sultrim Alioni. Sultrim Alioni in America? She was there, and also Annie Lodro, Annie Zimba, who were there at that time. And so I received Nundro teachings from Apa Rinpoche through Garado, who was then he translated for me, because he was already learning Tibetan. So I started doing the Nundro practice. Never finished it. But that's another story. So yes, in Manali there was also a painter called Dorje in Manali who I got to know. But then I was able to kind of work on deities, but I wouldn't say I had a deep knowledge at all at that point. Maybe I wouldn't even say that now, if I was really being humble. But it took a long time. It really takes a long time to understand. And that time was so different from now because there was nothing available in terms of books. There weren't photocopy machines. So everything you needed to copy, I didn't have a camera. Everything you needed to have a copy of, you had to draw yourself. So it involved a lot of that.
You studied with, or you stayed with the Rinpoche you received?
I stayed very near to Apa Rinpoche, and by that time I was separated from my girlfriend Frances and with a lady called Linda, who also had teachings from Apa Rinpoche, and she was studying Kathak dance, which is why we ended up in Varanasi in the winter mainly. She was studying Kathak dance, and then I was studying Sarod. So Benares was a good place to be for teachers of both. So in the winter we would spend like 4 or 5 months in Varanasi, and then go back to Himachal Pradesh or Kathmandu in the summers, basically.
Who was your Sarod teacher in Varanasi?
My main teacher in Varanasi was a Sarod player called Jotin Bajracharya, who was a student of Alauddin Khan. Alauddin Khan was the teacher of the father and teacher of Ali Akbar Khan and Ravi Shankar and many, many other great musicians. So Alauddin Khan, Gharana. But Jotin was a very strict teacher, not so easy to get on with. I wouldn't talk about him too much. But later I had a teacher in Kathmandu who was blind, who was really, really wonderful, but I'll explain that in a later period. Anyway, so from Manali, then moved back to Kathmandu and spent a year in Swayambhu, and then became living in Swayambhu in Kimdal village at the bottom of Swayambhu, in the house of Tara Bir Singh, who had previously been the Lord Mayor of Kathmandu. He had a big house and a big compound, and he lived upstairs, we lived downstairs, and there were various houses, little outhouses around. So then I became very good friends with a person called Keith Redman, who probably, I would say, became the first real Western guru in the Vajrayana tradition. Keith was also a Sarod player, was very brilliant, and had come as draft dodgers. A lot of Americans had come out because of the Vietnam War. They come to India, and Keith had come out and was a very, very talented musician, looked like a Viking, very red hair. And he lived up at Swayambhu, and he really wanted to attain siddhi. So he's a very serious practitioner. And he eventually, in a sense, did attain Siddhi and attracted quite a following of Western students, Western disciples who all wore white robes and, you know, had long hair and would do long retreats together and then come out of retreat and get radically drunk and all kinds of things. But Keith was had an incredible knowledge. He taught himself Sarod, listening only to tapes of Ali Akbar. He had no teacher as such. He was a very brilliant Sarod player. And his knowledge of Tibetan and Newar culture was quite phenomenal. And he was essentially wanted to attain Siddhi and was a very, very strong character and very determined. And I guess Keith was a very important figure at that particular time in the whole Kathmandu scene. Keith Redman, he had maybe, I don't know how many disciples, but they go to Nagi Gompa, do like 3 months retreat on a particular practice that he'd be given the transmission of. And
how old was he?
Keith was probably, he would have been around 74 now. He's probably about 4 years older than me, so I guess he'd have been about 28 at that time.
He was the recognized Western guru of Kathmandu.
Yeah, he was a legend. He was a legend of his time, and Keith Dowman learned a lot from Keith Redman for sure. Yeah, Keith was very, very brilliant mind, and he died. Keith died from taking a drug overdose after coming out of retreat. And he was cremated at Swayambhu, and I forget who was, Jamrian Control, when Jamrian Control was alive, supervised the cremation. And evidently, I'll say this, yeah, it's okay. When his body was being cremated, they poured some Rakshi alcohol onto the body, and then Keith evidently sat up. And Jamrian Control said that's a very bad sign. That's a story I heard, but there were lots of stories. Keith became very radical. He left, went to America, went to see Trungpa, and the Vajra guards, this wild character come in, dressed in white. They just didn't know what to make of him, and they wouldn't let him see him. And he said, "I'll put a curse on you if you don't let me see him." And immediately they all got stomachache. And he went in to see Trungpa, and evidently came back to America with a bullwhip, to Kathmandu with a bullwhip, wearing leather coats and things. So God knows what he was like. But they're really eccentric characters at that time, really, who were doing things. So Keith was a very good friend. And we fell out in the end because he had an affair with my then girlfriend, Linda, while I was away. So, just stuff like that. But it was kind of crazy. But crazy in a very different way. Keith was really, really determined to go, and I don't think there's been anybody like that since, really, that radical. Maybe Annie Zamba is Annie Zamba. She's also, if you wanted to interview her, you'd be here for a year. I started to write her life story, and I did about a third of it. It took me a year.
How many foreigners were there around?
Well, there were a lot of people would come to Kathmandu and hang out in Freak Street. Of course, I wasn't into drugs at all, so nothing to do with that, and I'd avoid all kinds of things like that, going to cafes where people hung out. So most of the people who came were either people who were smoking dope around Darbar Square in Kathmandu, or people who were starting to go trekking in the mountains. So at the beginning of the trekking, this was 1973 to 74. And during that time, I because of Keith Redman, essentially, my girlfriend Linda and I was also studying Charya Nitya dancing, the sacred dance of Kathmandu. And Keith was studying that. So one of the main teachers would come to the house twice a week, where the place where I lived, the room essentially, and teach the dances of these deities like Vajrayogini and the 5 Buddha families. And his son was a Newar artist who became quite famous, Gautam, who worked with the Japanese. And at that time in Kathmandu in '73, I met Siddhi Muni, the artist Siddhi Muni, and also Hugh Downs. Hugh Downs was also studying Thangka painting in Nepal. And his teacher was in Solukhumbu, was a Gomchen Leshe, who was his hermit yogi artist who was in retreat basically. So Hugh, being American and the son of a very famous American TV presenter or radio presenter, something like that, had money, and he built a little retreat house with a window that he could go up, and Oleshe was in retreat, so there was a window between them. So he was learning to draw based on Mipham's canon of iconography, which Oleshe was teaching him. I never went to meet Oleshe, but Hugh would bring the drawings back, the originals of Oleshe, which was the iconographical grids of deities like Vajravarahi, Shakrasamvara, the main bodhisattvas, some of the protectors, and I would copy them faithfully, and then Hugh would take them back to Oleshe, and I basically was able to draw in Oleshe style, and he was very happy that there was somebody who was able to pick it up. So because of that, I was introduced to the canon of iconography, essentially, and I began to understand the proportions of the deities and how they are drawn. Gomchen Oleshe illustrated the book called the Nyingma Icons, the little booklet, which was published by Kailash, originally Kailash, little book publishing company in Nepal. So those drawings of Oleshe kind of taught me a lot more than what I'd learned from Jampa originally. And the originals that Hugh kept, he posted back to America of Oleshe's drawings, and they never reached America. So the only ones that existed are the ones I made, the copies I made. So that was a very valuable kind of period of time. I guess I spent maybe 6 to 9 months working on these drawings of deities, a lot of which then went into the Anthony's first book on Tibetan Thangka painted by the Jacksons. Although I made a lot more drawings for that particular book at that time. After that, to speed things up a bit, I was basically back in Varanasi, and then for the last year I was in India. I went to, but Garadra took me to stay with Kamta Rinpoche in Tashijong, so I went to Tashijong and stayed there for basically a year. Linda and I, we were there. And Linda was working with Dozon Rinpoche in the office, trying to fundraise to start up this craft community, the Tashijong craft community. And I was working for Kamta Rinpoche, making paintings, copying paintings, mainly Sakri for the initiations he was going to be giving in Bhutan for the royal family of Bhutan a year or two later.
And you had something to copy it from?
I was copying from his original Thangkas, the individual deities, making them just, the whole assembly of deities with a retinue around. And then there were other ones offering cards, which another artist, Pao Gyaltsen, who was living in Tashijong, had drawn, and I was painting those in because, he knew how to make those drawings. Because there were a few very good Thangka painters and wood carvers in Tashijong. He was very famous for the carpets, the wood carving, and the Tonka painting, essentially. So Kamta Rinpoche was a really brilliant artist. And while I was there, he was making the drawing of this particular Tonka up here, which is a form of Yamantaka, which is very rarely practiced. So he was actually making that drawing almost like it was eidetic. He didn't have really a reference. He was making the drawing on the canvas, which was quite phenomenal skill to be able to just draw deities straight from a raw canvas, essentially, without any reference.
You learned again by copying and observing him.
I basically worked for him, and I was, when I arrived, I was still doing the Nundro, and he I'd met him before twice and had very strong connection, not verbal connection, just connection in not speaking, which was our main connection. I could go and sit with him and stay for an hour without saying anything, and neither of us were uncomfortable. We were quite content to be carrying on what we were doing. If I would go up to his room and he was writing some text or reading something, I could just sit with him, and it was just wonderful to spend that kind of time with such a great master who's also happened to be a really great artist. Because
how was he as a person?
He was wonderful, he was phenomenal, impeccable, magnificent, yeah, unbelievably beautiful, yeah. And very kind, very, very kind and generous. And many things happened with him, which is another story. But while I was doing prostrations, there was one particular point. We moved to a house in a little village called Bunuri, which was a house where Kamta Rinpoche and the Togdens had stayed originally, before they started developing the land at Tashijong and this house in Bunuri. And I remember doing prostrations and getting so angry one day that I picked up the prostration board. I just thought, why am I doing this? You know, why am I doing this? I just trying to do these prostrations all the time. Picked it up and threw it at the altar, and I felt this incredible calmness, almost like there was a release from tension. And I went to see Kamta Rinpoche and told him what had happened. And he thought it was very funny. He laughed and he said, well, maybe you shouldn't be doing that. He said, maybe you should just paint, you know. So it was like he gave me permission to carry on, which is what I needed, because all of the Westerners were so serious about, you know, practice, you have to learn Tibetan, you have to study these texts, you know. It goes on and on and on and on. It still goes on and on and on and on, forever and ever. So in a sense, it was like he gave me permission just to work on the deities, which has basically been my life's work, I guess, on one level, yeah.
And then decided to move back to the UK?
We moved back to the UK because Linda, my partner Linda, could no longer stay in India. She was American, very difficult to get visas. In Varanasi, we knew the CID, the police. They were very good friends. They were very nice. They liked us a lot because we were not. We were very pucker in the sense, you know. I'd go off and study with this maestro, musician, and Jill was learning traditional dance, and it was, you know, it was very easy, but it got difficult later on. I could have actually had citizenship in India because I'd been there more than 5 years by the time that I left, but I don't think that would apply anymore. And then I came back to the West, and there was nothing whatsoever apart from the Buddhist Society in London and Samyeling in Scotland.
So when you were still studying in Nepal, in India, which topics were you most interested in? Which themes in the painting, or which deities?
I was basically working to earn a living, a pittance, essentially. I wouldn't get paid for the work I did in Tashijong, but if I needed anything, Kamta Rinpoche would provide it, for sure. I don't really know how I lived. It was so easy to live 100 rupees would last a month then. 100 rupees now is probably the price of a couple of bottles of water, I don't know. We live very simply. Kerosene, water, lamplight in the night, painting, drawing by lamplight at night, kerosene lamp. No photocopies, no camera, everything just had to be done there and then. A very strong discipline to do that, really.
When you came back to the UK, did you know that you wanted to continue painting?
I did, yeah, yes. So, a few old friends. One friend who was, who'd made money, commissioned a couple of paintings that he would give to friends. So basically, I came back to the West and then there was nothing really at all. And we brought the lamas over from Tashijong. My friend Noel, and Faye, who also lived in Kathmandu and lived together in Tashijong for a time. Noel was a serious practitioner also, but before he'd left England, he'd been a student of Ronnie Lang. Ronnie Lang, the psychiatrist, if you call him that, the visionary psychiatrist, and also was at Samyeling with Akon Rinpoche and Trungpa. So when we met again in London, I lived with Noel and Faye, and they introduced me to Anthony Arias. This was maybe 1978. We went over to Anthony, who was living in a house, not the house in Parkfields, but a house somewhere further down the river. And Marilla, I'm not even sure the kids were born at that point. Maybe Arabella was possibly just born, I can't remember. But Anthony and we got on very well, and Anthony, I guess I went back to see him and he asked me to draw the logo for Serindia. He was just starting Serindia. So I drew this double lotus that he wanted and a couple of other things, and then that was the beginning of a long, long relationship working with Anthony since 1978 until he passed Serindia on to Shane in Bangkok, whenever that was. So
in the UK, were you also involved in the growing Buddhist community here?
I was... no, I wasn't involved with Samyeling. A person who was very instrumental was Edward Henning, who I mentioned before, I believe. Edward was another real genius. He was quite amazing. Edward had been given a Tibetan astrological diagram as a present, and with the tortoise and the trigrams and the mewas and 9 numbers and everything, cyclic animals. And he didn't know what it meant, and he wanted to understand what it meant. So in the process, he began learning Tibetan and Tibetan astrology, essentially. And Edward was basically Kamakagyu, and he was brilliant. He's a genius, Edward, really. He died 2 years ago now, and back then, in the late 70s, we hatched a plan to make a book on the deities of the Kamakagyu tradition. And Edward already had a lot of Tibetan texts that he was translating from on the iconography of the deities. And we'd made a list of about, 90 deities, of the major important deities, which I was going to draw with their iconographical grids, and then we were going to compile this book. Basically on the deities themselves, their attributes, what they were holding, and also their symbolism, if that was the right word, what everything implied, what everything was about, and it also included, it was a very ambitious project, included mandalas, and for example, the Chakrasamvara, Edward wanted to include 19 different Chakrasamvara mandalas in this project, which was huge. So Anthony lent me his house in Scotland, and I went up with my then wife, Helen. We moved to the old post office in Arena in Scotland, and I began working on this project, making these drawings, and did it for maybe a year and a half. Made 70, I think, or 80 iconographical drawings, which are also based on what I'd learned from Oleshe's work. And it was at that time that I really began to understand the minutiae of the iconography of deities, like working with a translation that Edward had made of the grid of 1,000-armed Lokeshvara. There was a mistake in the actual text, and I couldn't work it out. It's been weeks and weeks trying to figure it out, and then it occurred to me that it wasn't below the knee line, it was above. There's two units. You know, it was just little things like that. And it was just going into the real minutiae of how deities are drawn and looking at the canons of measurement. So that, in a sense, was my main practice, I guess, all along, was understanding how the deities are drawn. And I guess through understanding how they're drawn, it's easy to almost visualize them very clearly, which is something that I guess is lacking in most Westerners who practice.
So that was the first work you did for a book?
Yeah, but we never got funding. And then Edward had a child and was working as a physics and mathematics teacher in school. So he had no funding. We didn't get any funding. Unfortunately, that was the main project. That would have been the best thing we would have done together on this planet. And this, you know, I recently typed out on my computer, I typed in what Edward had written in the proposal, or what we worked on together. And, you know, looking at it now, it's way ahead of its time still. There's nothing like that. You know, all of these books will come out on deities, but they don't touch the real essence of what that kind of depth the main transmission was coming from Tengu Rinpoche, who would often go into retreat to kind of find out something like Dodje Benagchen. I remember working on Dodje Benagchen and the various forms of him. He has several different forms. And Tengu Rinpoche had to go in to do a short retreat to get some information on the deity itself. So just things of this nature. And then Edward was very instrumental with the 16th Karmapa when he came to the UK. And also when various lamas came, Kamta Rinpoche stayed with us when we were in London for a couple of weeks. Kamta Dozang and Chucho Rinpoche.
How do you remember this visit? It was quite influential.
It was difficult with them because the house they were staying in was very small in Barnes, and Noel had no money, and of course you need money to take these lamas around in the car. My good friend Stuart had a Rolls Royce. Stuart was a female, and she was a very important friend in my life, a very dear friend. And she would always drive the lamas around in the Rolls Royce. So whenever the Karmapa came or something, it would be, well, he only came twice actually, but you know, various lamas would come and she'd drive them in the Rolls. And so we virtually lived together in this car, even though we weren't together as a couple, but we were very, very close friends for many, many years. And she was very visionary and would organise events. She made a film of the Lama dances in Tashichong, for example. And yeah, things just came and went, fell apart, because there was no funding as such, no opportunities to do anything. And of course I had no credentials, never went really to school properly. So.
And how was the visit of the Karmapa like?
There's always difficulty around Lama's visits. When the 16th Karmapa came to London, did the black hat ceremony a couple of times. Yeah, there was a lot of... I'd met him in India before, in Sarnath. Spent a day with him one time, which was great fun. Just talking, basically playing, almost. Very playful. And of course then it becomes very precious when his bodyguards trying to keep people out, and who are you, why are you here, what should you be? And there was one person who came from America who the Karmapa had stayed with for a long time, and they wouldn't even let him in to see the Karmapa, things like that. So often very difficult situations arise around the preciousness of the teachers. And I guess it's more so like that now, really. But then there were very small audiences as well. It was very difficult to get an audience for... Kamta Rinpoche Dozong, Kamta's English wasn't very good. Dozong was a very good English speaker. Chujel was very shy. But we got him booked at Chelsea Town Hall, and they'd never done anything like that before. And just to get an audience, it was very difficult. People just didn't know people who were interested in the Dharma, really. And then Sokil was just starting at this particular time as well.
And who were your spiritual teachers?
None.
Tibetan?
None. After Kamta Rinpoche, that was it, really. Yeah. Then I've been involved in a lot of different things since then. I wouldn't say I'm a practitioner as such, As I mentioned before, a large part of the last 12 years, basically, since my daughter was drowned, I've gone into a completely different direction and been researching afterlife in great detail and opened myself to the evidence of what has been revealed in our time with regard to all aspects of consciousness and life. And personally I find that the teachings of the Dharma are fantastic for the culture that it evolved within the Indo-Tibetan culture. But I think it's very difficult for the transmission to the West. There's various points that I take issue with that I find, I don't find evidence for in modern times of consciousness studies that fit with certain things. Which, for example, reincarnation, which I've also looked into in great depth here with the various research. Ian Stevenson was the main person who did more than 3,000 cases of people who remember previous lives, children who remember previous lives. And this is now being carried on by his protege, who is somebody called Jim Tucker at the University of Virginia, Department of Perceptual Studies. So I've been deeply involved in doing much more research into the modern evidence of, especially through near-death experience. So my spiritual path is pretty out there, basically, compared to most people. Because, a lot of my Buddhist friends think I'm crazy, but the evidence is phenomenal, and I have no doubt that what I've studied is the most valuable thing I've ever done in my life, really, at this time, really. It's enabled me to deal with things that most people can't deal with, like losing a child. It's not easy. It was my way through. It's almost like I had to say, okay, now I start from scratch again.
What was the first book that actually became created? Was it the one on Algae?
Well, the first book was Tibetan Tonka painted by the Jacksons, David and Janice Jackson, which I worked on extensively with the drawings, because they made some drawings for that. Janice, I don't know if they're still together, But they weren't good enough, basically, so Anthony wanted me to remake the drawings, which I did, and I got some flack for doing that, actually. Didn't get paid, but I did it in Scotland, and then added more drawings in the second edition of the Jackson's book. And then after that, let me think. There were the three main projects, I guess the three main ones. Alfie was one, but that was small. Secret Visions was another. Tibetan medical paintings. And I'm missing some other things, but there were many, many other things in between.
Well, your encyclopedia.
And the encyclopedia, of course, yeah. Yeah, yes.
The handbook.
And the handbook later, yeah. Yeah. Yes.
With Keith Dowman.
Oh, the sitters, yes, that was back in the 70s, yeah. Yeah, when I came, just after I came back, not long after I came back from India, Keith came to see me. I was living in Bath then. And Keith drove down with Stuart in this Rolls-Royce car. I didn't know what a Rolls-Royce was, actually. I thought it was a big car. And it was her car. But Keith had just translated the lives of the 84 siddhas, and he wanted me to illustrate it. So then I started making line drawings of the 84 siddhas. And then that fell through with the line drawings, and then Roger Dean was an illustrator who did a lot of record album covers, very good artist, and his brother Martin and Roger Dean worked with Richard Branson, who set up Virgin Records, and Roger produced a book called Views, which was it's the same size as a record album, an LP album, and the same price. And so it went on sale in Virgin shops, and it reached #1 in book sales without reaching a single bookshop. So he made a lot of money from this project, and then he did a few other books and set up his own publishing company. And then he came across, through a mutual friend, came across the Siddha project, which he was very excited by, so he wanted them in colour. So then I started working in colour. The original drawings were scrapped, and then I started making the paintings, and there were too many paintings to make 84 individual images. It's a huge amount of work. But Roger did pay me. He was great. He was one of the few people who ever paid me in my life. And eventually that fell through because they closed. Things didn't work out in the long run. They took on too many projects and they couldn't afford to finance them. So they went bust, and then eventually it got taken up again by another publisher, which was Penguin Arcana at that time. And eventually did get published, and is still in publication by Inner Traditions in America. But that was a lot of work. It was 3 or 4 years of work, and you know, the amount of money you get paid for that is pathetic by comparison, I guess, really. But I did. The paintings did serve me well because I sold a lot of them and started to collect a lot of the art that you see around the house. So this is a long, long story. The most interesting part, I think, is the end part of what I did with the artist in the pole, essentially. Yeah.
And about the books. So how did you work on the Alchi book? That's a very important book. And then on your encyclopedia look like. How do you remember this, and what was your role?
Anthony and Marie-Laure Yaroslav went several times to Ladakh. I never went to Ladakh when I was in India because it only opened in 1976, I think. I was leaving then. And they wanted me to come and see Alchi. And I didn't have any money to pay, and I didn't want anybody else to pay for a flight like that, which would be very expensive. No money. We were living in Scotland, very poor. I can't remember what year it was. But so I never went to Alchi. And then Yaroslav took all of these photos, and then I had to recreate the structure of the temple from the photos he'd taken, which was very difficult because you couldn't figure out exactly how many deities or which wall or how the whole thing looked. There was a basic map of it, but to figure out how the deities fitted together, it took ages and ages to work that out. Just from the photos, I spent many, many hours, but I'm used to doing stuff like that, trying to figure very unfathomable things out. I'm very tenacious at doing that, so I got it right in the end, I believe. But I've never actually been to Alchi. So my main work on that, apart from helping Anthony with the book layouts and the illustration sequence and things of that nature, was actually reconstructing the frescoes inside the temple and the statues, and to make sense of the ground plan that was being presented, really. I still have something, and I think of some of those drawings here, I think, that we used for that. Then there was the Secret Visions.
Yeah, that's a beautiful book as well.
Secret Visions arose. A flat I was living in London was my friend Stuart's flat. After she left, got taken over by Beverly Coburn, who was James Coburn's wife. Was a friend of Stuart's. She was really a very amazing human being who donated a lot of really expensive art to the Los Angeles County Museum, Tibetan art. And she'd come over and collect pieces. She'd take me to the markets like Bermondsey and Portobello Road to look at things and for me to kind of appraise them, so if you'd buy them. So I really enjoyed those little shopping trips with her because I could never do anything like that. And she had tons of money basically to spend on tax deductible. And after she left, I happened to be in the flat, and this person came with this text from France, which was the Secret Visions, the book itself, the actual manuscript. And I was looking at it and I thought, this is really phenomenal, this is really incredible. And this was a dealer. And I never had this thought ever since. He went to the toilet and something in me said, take it and run, pick it up and run, get out of here. This is going to disappear. And I managed to control that thought. I just thought it shouldn't be sold. He wanted £250,000, he wanted for it, I think, or something. And I just thought, this is something really special. I'm looking at it, I don't really know what it is, but I can see there's various deity attributes here. So that came to the attention of Anthony, and so then I worked on that, making outlines of all of the plates, essentially, and working on that book for a couple of months, which was very exciting and very fantastic to work on something like that and to be able to study, not the actual, have the originals, but to have the plates and to study the iconography, and because you were drawing all of those different ritual attributes and Tolma offerings and various things, which was really phenomenal to do. And the same thing with the Tibetan medical paintings, which I spent, I think, 4 months on that, actually working on that. One of the plates was missing, so I had to redraw that plate, and then I had to work on identifying each individual attribute that had been translated by Zengor Rinpoche and Gyume Dorje, and also by Funan Meyer, who worked on it. But I think largely, possibly I'm not given enough credit, I think Gyume did a huge amount of work on that project also, with Zengor Rinpoche at SOAS, when they were working together at SOAS. So I worked on that for several months, and that was fantastic to work on. But
how did you redraw the plate?
Because I had while I was in Lhasa, I bought the Chinese version of the text. I given that away to a Tibetan doctor friend, but the Chinese version, have you seen the Chinese edition? And it has those bits of the thing so you can put them all together. And I did actually end up in Buryat and saw some of the originals there a few years back when I was in Buryat.
Which plate is it?
It's a plate on, I think, one of the last plates. It's essentially on, it's got a lot of kind of images of masturbation and things of that nature. A lot of the dark. It's to do with divination at the end, really. I think it's around the 70th plate. I can't remember exactly. Things that you shouldn't do to increase the pulse, and things that you shouldn't eat.
And then you were given a scholarship.
I was, yes.
Howard,
Yes, I was indeed, yes, yeah.
And then you began working on your encyclopedia, is that the case?
I was already working on that. I'd been working on it for making the drawings. The drawings took me, God knows how many years, many years to make, which I made in Scotland. And I brought my wife Helen at that time had got a grant from the Harold Hyam Wingate Foundation because she was studying Yiddish, a Yiddish poet. She just entered Wilson College, called Itzhak Monga. She was going to do a PhD on his work, which she did. She's now the professor of Yiddish at UCL London, so she works a lot with keeping the Yiddish language alive and is a native speaker. She grew up speaking Yiddish as the first language. So she'd got a grant from them, and I applied. And I went, and they happened to have an artist there on the board. And I took a box of my drawings and an explanation of what I'd been doing. And the artist realised that they'd been drawn with a brush, and he couldn't believe anybody could do that. He'd never seen anything like it. So they were I was very grateful for the first time in my life to be financed properly for a period of time. But I used that money basically to carry on working on medical paintings as well as that. So that kind of subsidised the work on that. And then I eventually did write the encyclopedia. And that's when I got together with my partner Jill after I'd just finished writing the book, and it was just published literally, so, which was 20 years ago.
So in fact, almost all the books or your paintings were made in Scotland.
Yeah, in retreat basically, yes, yeah. Working all night, go up, work in the day, and the kids grew up there, and when the kids went to sleep, I'd then go up to my loft, and the wind would be blowing outside, and the rain would be pounding down. It'd be freezing cold in the winter. No money to pay electric bills or anything, but just carried on working, yeah.
And how would you describe the style you draw and paint in the books? You've studied with different teachers?
I'd say a lot of what I did in the encyclopedia is based on existing things that I've seen or still see, because you look at so many paintings and you see the way a certain group of offerings are presented, or just the way things are put together, and you realise the individuality of certain artists. So it's almost like it was me kind of having matured in a power of really seeing and understanding what I was seeing, and choosing what I felt was best to illustrate various aspects of it. So I made the drawings literally over a long, maybe I can't even remember how long they took. It was essentially made in Scotland. At least 2 years making the drawings, and then it took me a whole year to write the text with a pen, kneeling on the floor. And Anthony gave me his old Apple Classic computer. So at the end of each day I would type what I'd written by one finger. I still type with one finger onto the computer, and that became the text of the encyclopedia. So it was almost like I would sit down and then think, okay, now you could focus on this, and then just write on that particular attribute or image or tree or creature or offering, whatever. And of course, at different times I would think, oh, I forgot to add that, and so I would go back to the text and add a little bit more detail. Yeah, so it built up. It took quite a few years to make. It was a huge project, yeah.
And you would read Tibetan texts?
No.
No.
No, I don't read
So
Tibetan texts.
Go back to your memory, if you
I have a lot of resource of imagery upstairs, books that I've collected, catalogues from various exhibitions and museums, and things that I study again and again and again, and again, yeah. And of course really fascinated by the iconography of the wrathful deities, which of course is the more complex compositions.
Why were you fascinated by the wrathful deities?
Well, there's a lot more to say about them, essentially. There's a lot more to know and to say, because if a figure has, 9 faces and 34 arms like Vajrabhairava, or 4 faces and 12 arms like Chakrasamvara, there's a lot more than just a peaceful Buddha deity, and then the shapes of the faces, and then the expressions that they have, and the colours, and why the colours are like this, and what it looks like from the back. And to try and understand the whole thing as a visualization in 3 dimensions of how it works, it's kind of building up, I guess, like that. And yeah, so it's like, Jeff Watt is really quite amazing, because he's a scholar and he's reached something. I would say it's not the same as what I've done in my life at all, really, because I've learned through drawing, where he's learned through, reading the text and studying these deities, and his website is phenomenal. I do have great respect for him, yeah, as somebody who's done something really worthwhile in this time.
And what was your own input into the tradition in your paintings? So you've also changed?
I guess some of the work I did with the siddhas, which I considered illustrations, they were for illustrated paperback book, a mass market essentially. That was the idea originally. So of course airbrushed. Airbrush, hadn't been used in Tibetan art, of course. And then when I did go back, it was a long time before I was able to go back to Nepal and Tibet. It was in 1988 when I went to Tibet and travelled to Mount Kailash with Namkha Nobu's group, that whole big trip of like 100 people. And then in Kathmandu I realised that a lot of the things that they'd influenced the modern Thongka market, like the use of the way there's yellow in the sky, for example, like sunsets in the sky. And then now I see, if I see various Thongkas that are produced, I can recognise that, those flowers and those leaves are ones that I've drawn. But I've drawn them from other sources myself, and they are changed. I do have my own style, I guess, but they are largely based on existing images from that I've kind of looked at, literally thousands and thousands and thousands of Thongkas and deity images. Yeah. And I still look at them and still ponder on them. I'm giving a talk on 5th of May in London on Vajrabhairava and Vajrakila and the myth of Rudra, and so putting together some images to go with that, and once again I'm entering the whole other worlds again with knowledge, but still there's always more to understand and to see in a different way. it's never ending. It's an infinite perspective of visionary art. Really, it's quite phenomenal.
And essentially, it means combining the styles of different artists, teachers, and schools into your own.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah.
As it has probably always been.
Well, I would say to begin with, it was essentially a léché style that I adopted, and the lips were very thick in the léchés, the mouths were very thick. So a lot of the work that appears in the Jacksons, the what's it called, Tibetan Tonga painting techniques, methods, and materials, was drawn from my léchés work. So that was very early. So, like later on. There was another huge project with Graham Coleman and the Orient Foundation, which was to produce a kind of almost like a telephone directory of all of the teachers alive and all of the Buddhist centers and all of the practices. So I worked on that for several years, and I produced, I don't know, 120 new drawings of lineage holders, some deities, many lineage holders. And that project never really came to fruition. And once again, for 3 years I worked on it. Money never came through. So, difficulty. My advice when people ask, they'd like to study Tongfen, I say, don't do it. But it's different now. You never get paid. It's better you work in a restaurant washing dishes. You get more. It's been very difficult on that level.
And is there a book of those that you made that's your favorite?
The encyclopedia, I think, is good. But it existed, I was writing it before the existence of the internet, and there's so much more information available now. I go on and you can find it all kinds, anything you want almost, not quite. Some of the things I look up, there's nothing existing yet. But, yeah, it's so different really now. And that was from 25 years ago when I began writing that, and that's, it's a long time, really. So some of the drawings that I made for this other project, which was run by a foundation called the Orient Foundation, which I think is still working in Tibet also, I put in 2 books, or 1 book by Shambhala, which was a colouring book, which came out 2 years ago, and that was very popular. They're good drawings. They're nice drawings. I got a box and I open those boxes and I look at the drawings and I think, the peace that those figures have, I don't have that in me. Salvador Dali said that when he would look at his paintings that he'd made. It's a peace that I can't possibly possess because they're so still, they're so authentic, I guess, in many ways. It's hard to believe I drew them because now I have a tremble. My eyesight is no good and my hand is really too painful to draw and paint because of doing so much work.
And what are the favorite paintings or drawings you've done?
I did one summer, I did three drawings that appear in the second colouring book of Padmasambhava, which is based on an original painting by Kamta Rinpoche, which I redrew in Tashijong, and then redrew again, twice here, and Green Tara and White Tara, made 3 drawings over a 6-week period, which are in the second colouring book. They're too detailed to be made that small, really. So.
So now, Newari art?
Newari art, yes.
So you became interested in it when you were in Kathmandu, and then you became
on the trip to Kailash in 1987 or 86.
Was it your first trip to Tibet?
It was my first time in Tibet, yeah. And that was travelling, supposedly going to Lhasa and then going around, crossing the Sangpo and then going to Kailash with Nobu for a retreat. But we went to Lhasa and the river was too high for the trucks to cross, so we had to go back to Lhasa and then drive right round the Silk Road, essentially, and come at Kailash from a 360-degree circle, basically, going right round the Silk Road, which was quite an amazing experience. And after coming back to Kathmandu, I met a Thangka painter in Kathmandu called Punzog, who was from Sikkim, and he'd set up a shop in Dharmamag called Punzog Art. We correct any Thangka mistakes, it said. And so, because there's so many inauthentic paintings being made by the Tamang artists, Punzog became my very good friend. And I would go back to Kathmandu and start to meet the Newar artists who were producing these great works. I met Siddhi Muni way back in the 1980s, and then I met Siddhi Muni again, and he'd made 3 paintings at the end of his life that had taken him 10 years to put together. And I was trying to find somebody to buy these paintings, but in the end I sold all my own work at Tibet House in New York, most of my own paintings, and had enough money to buy 2 of these 3 masterpieces. And because I did that, then I started to get to know all the Newar artists in Kathmandu Valley, a community of them, and bought, and ended up buying many hundreds of their paintings, and also many contemporary Tibetan paintings like the ones in this room. Also the artist who made these, Chewang Dorje, that's another whole story, sad story at the moment. Some of his work I have on display in London at the moment, in the October Gallery exhibition. So for the last, I guess from the late 90s onwards, I started collecting modern Newar paintings, meeting the artists, sitting down with them and getting really inspired together, really inspired together, which was wonderful, because it was such a different feeling from Western people. That they're so humble and so eager to know about the art, the deities that they're painting. Kathmandu back then, it was very unhealthy. I think at that time there was maybe a 20th or 30th of the population in there. It was very, very small. I can't remember the exact number of people. But, Bodha Stupa was in the field, in rice fields all around. And you go there, and then there was the Chini Lama. Chini Lama was the curator of Bodha Stupa. Chini Lama from Chinese. He was, and I think there was just 2 monasteries just being established at that point. Swayambhu was, you either lived in Swayambhu or Bodha later on. There was nowhere to live in Bodha at that real time. So, but Kimdal at the bottom of Swayambhu Hill was a little community with quite a few eccentric people there, like Ira Cohen and Hetty and Angus MacLeish, who were kind of from the living theatre. Ira Cohen was, to me, one of the greatest poets of our time. He was really quite out there.
That was in the early 70s?
This was in the early 70s, yeah. 73, Ira was there, and he made a film of the Kumbh Mela, which I watched in the 70s also, which is quite phenomenal to watch now. You'd see all of these things happening. Yogis being able to do this incredible postures. Yogis lifting these huge rocks with their penises, and all of these things. So I'd always had this kind of connection with sadhus. I loved sadhus, but I never got into smoking dope or anything with them. but there was, yeah, just that whole culture. And then it was very simple. It took a long time to find Siddhi Muni, and Siddhi Muni didn't speak any English at all. And he was the kind of the legendary artist of Kathmandu Valley. There'd been others before him, but his father, Ananda Muni, had been taken to Lhasa in the early 1920s and had come to the attention of the 13th Dalai Lama, the regent, because he was able to make portraits of the Newar merchants around the Bangkok, and then he started making portraits of some of the Tibetan aristocrats, and evidently was rewarded by the 13th Dalai Lama with a supply of pigments and silver coins and a chest that he gave him and some brocade as a kind of offering for this young boy who was he considered to be a divine artist. And then Siddhi Muni, Ananda Muni, when he was back in Kathmandu, started making paintings based on black and white photography, which was just happening at that time, of the kind of all of the ranas, ceremonial headdresses with feathers. They'd take black and white silver plate photos and you'd see these three-dimensional figures. So he started painting the deities in 3 dimensions, like Avalokiteshvara on the half shell, like taken from Botticelli's Venus on the half shell, or Mahakala on the half shell, showing veins in his arms and the shadows of the silver chains or the jewellery that was worn, and with perspective, so it was like a 3-dimensional. So in a sense, there was this radical new movement being developed in Newar painting, and I became fascinated by it. And the first artist I met was Uday Charan Shrestha and his brother Dinesh Charan Shrestha, who now teaches in Berkeley, teaches Newar art in Berkeley, California. They were very shy. It took me 12 years to get to know all of these artists with my friend Punsog, and to gain their trust, to gain their confidence, and to really become very, very close friends with them, in as much as we had this incredible level of inspiration together. We could talk about future compositions they would make, and it would be so inspiring, and they weren't having to copy this thing again, because they were kept under control by some of the tonka shops in Kathmandu Valley. So I was trying to encourage them to just make original paintings, paint what they wanted to paint, and just do it and see what you can do, with this real incredible talent. And some of the works that they produce now are phenomenal, and they're being swallowed up by the Chinese, collected by the Chinese. They become megastars in China now, and I find it quite interesting what is happening in China. I haven't been there myself, but I do think the influence of the art, Tibetan art that's being collected by Chinese, exhibited. There's lots of exhibitions and art fairs taking place with ethnic arts, and they call it ethnic arts, but has an influence on a lot of Chinese who are now becoming much more committed Buddhists. And a friend of mine who's been to Tibet, who's a Newar, who's travelled as a travel agent, he's been in like 30 times, but he's also a collector and a very honest person. He's watched it. He's more than 30 times, it's probably 60 times he's gone into Tibet. And he said he's watched it over the years and how everything is changing. And, he said basically if anything's going to change the Chinese attitude, it's the art, really. The art is having a very strong effect. And the people who are collecting this art are very wealthy and often in positions of power. And I think that's a very good thing. Newar art I see as devotional rather than meditative, whereas Tibetan art is designed for meditation, of course, visualization practice. Newar art to me is much more, the deities themselves are depicted as divine beings as such. They're 3-dimensional. Their faces are absolutely beautifully rendered. There's not any Newar art in this room, but the rest of the house is full of it, especially upstairs. So that's been a very inspiring journey, And I was going back twice a year to Nepal to collect art and spend a few weeks with the artists. But now they have so many clients that I can't collect anymore, and I don't need to anyway. So. But they're doing very well. And they work as a community. There's probably around 100 artists, and they will meet together, have picnics, appraise each other's work, with no real hint of jealousy or anything like that. It's a very, very powerful, like a guild, like they had in Lhasa, the Guild of Artists. They were really like guilds from the European medieval times.
You yourself have influenced Nepali art as well.
I've influenced it by collecting it and by inspiring the artists sometimes and bringing them more to public attention, I think, because people think, well, if he's collecting this stuff, we should do it too, you know. So it's a bit like that. This material, it's yeah. I don't know. I really don't know. I don't wish to overplay my role in anything.
There are also quite many fake paintings of yours sold as your
There have been, indeed. Yes. Yeah, I have seen them over the years, but okay.
Yeah. Robert, what would you still like to pursue in your life? Some interests?
Well, I like running my website. I like making the prints I'm making, particularly prints. I can make small ones myself because a lot of the work I've collected is on the website, and I'm trying to make that available for people. And a lot of the paintings I've bought, I've just spent, huge amounts of money because that's, this particular composition exists. This composition exists, and if I buy it, it can be preserved in some way. At least it can be reproduced, and making things available for practitioners, which is also not a financially viable thing to have done, because the amount of money I spent on the actual art is nothing like what I get back from selling prints. But I love making them. I love making the images available. So that's kind of my role, is to help nurture the production of the art, the creation of the art, the authenticity of the art, the patience of the art more than anything, the ability to paint something with real love rather than thinking I'm making a copy and it's going to be, I'm not going to get paid, I'm going to be given a deposit for the next painting as a payment. That's how it used to work. Now it's completely different. And I think that's a great thing to have happened in our time.
And I think you said somewhere that you would like to work on the symbolism of the deities.
I did like to work on the symbolism of the deities, and I do like working on it, but I feel it's a bit late now. I'm 70 years old. My memory is not good. My eyesight is very bad. I don't have that much time. I can't really write because I don't have... It's just to write all of this stuff with one finger is very difficult. There's a lot of lost opportunities. I could have done so much in my time that I haven't been able to do just because of lack of support, basically. Yeah.
Well, you still can.
Not really. I can try, but I also believe in morphic resonance. Morphic resonance is Rupert Sheldrake, who's a scientist friend, discovered this principle where certain birds would start pecking the tops of milk bottles, metal tops, to get the milk outside, and these birds wouldn't migrate; they'd be local. So they would start once one series of birds had learned to peck open a top in England, for example, then in New Zealand they would do it at the same time. So it's almost like whatever you learn goes into a field of awareness, and it remains there, so it's much more accessible. So I do feel that, everything I do, or I've learned in my time has made the information more accessible. I think that's how things work. Knowledge is, you know, they call it university where you learn, but actually it's more like diversity really, because you learn specific facets of a particular subject really.
Why do you find esotericism and agnosticism important?
Esotericism and
Gnosticism.
Why do I find it important? Because it's self-inquiry. Self-inquiry from the whole field of my life, really. Just looking at what I've absorbed and what I've learned. And do I need to go to somebody to receive a teaching which is going to make me identify my true nature? I don't know. I don't think of it like that anymore at all. I'm not looking for anything like that, really, in my life.
Do you have any advice or message for current and future students and scholars, mostly students of Tibetan studies?
As long as you have funding, you can do what you like, really, yeah. And I think it's amazing that people, you know, some of the work, like recently, I dip into the hidden history of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which, you know, just to look at the research in that is so valuable. I doubt if many people do, but yeah, now these individual scholars who are working on specific things are quite fantastic. But it's who we are essentially. It's our real life, our daily life, our dream life, actually. That's important to integrate, and you know, I've got a long way to go in that journey personally. But it's for me to resolve that. It's not for somebody to give me a method of resolution. I feel the tools are always there for all of us, really. Our true nature is always there.